They say the night hides many secrets, but some secrets are too dark, too terrifying to remain hidden forever. In a quiet village far from the eyes of the world, lived a girl named Kioma. At just 16, she was sent to live with her uncle after her parents' death. A fresh start, they said, a new home, a new beginning. But what she walked into was a nightmare she could never escape. Every night, when the world fell silent, her door creaked open, and in the darkness a shadow loomed over her bed. The same man who was supposed to protect her, the man everyone trusted. Kioma tried to cry for help, but who would believe her? In the eyes of the villagers, her uncle was a respected man, a good man. Lies, they would say, a young girl trying to destroy a man's home. And so she suffered in silence, waiting, hoping, praying. But then one night, something happened. A force beyond this world. Something no one could explain. That night, her uncle entered her room as usual. But what he saw made his blood run cold. What did he see? What really happened that night? And how did a simple village girl shake an entire community to its core? Stay with me, because this is not just a story. It's a warning, a lesson, a tale of pain, betrayal, and an ending that will leave you speechless. Now, let me take you to the very beginning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a dull orange glow over the small village of Umuaku. The dusty paths, lined with thatched mud huts, stretched endlessly before Kioma as she stood by the graves of her parents. The fresh mound of earth was still damp, the scent of wet soil thick in the air. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she clutched the thin wrapper tied around her small frame. They were gone. Her mother, the only person who had ever shielded her from the cruelty of the world, was now beneath the cold earth. Her father, once a strong man who provided for their family, had been taken by a strange illness that no herbalist could cure. Kioma was alone. The village elders had gathered under the big udala tree, speaking in hushed tones. Their wrinkled faces were creased with concern as they debated her fate. It was common tradition when a child was left without parents, relatives had to take them in. "She cannot stay here," one of the men said, shaking his head. "A 16-year-old girl living alone? That is an abomination. Her uncle, Obinna, is a wealthy man," another elder spoke. "Let him take her in. He has a big house in the next village, and his wife, Amaka, will take care of her." Chioma's heart pounded. Uncle Obinna. She barely knew him. He had only visited their family a few times, always carrying himself with the pride of a man who had seen the world beyond the village. His wife, Amaka, was a beautiful but cold-looking woman, known for her sharp tongue. "Kioma," the village chief finally said, turning to her, "you will go and live with your uncle. He will care for you like his own daughter." Daughter? A bitter taste filled Kioma's mouth. She did not feel like anyone's daughter anymore. She said nothing as they led her away, her small bundle of belongings tied in a faded cloth. Her feet dragged against the dusty path as she followed the elder who would take her to her new home. The journey to her uncle's village, Umuobi, took several hours. As they approached his compound, Kioma felt a sinking feeling in her chest. The house was grand, far bigger than any hut in their village. Tall walls surrounded it, and the gate was made of heavy iron. The compound itself was neat, with large mango trees lining the yard. Chickens pecked at the ground, and goats lazed under the shade. Aunt Amaka stood at the entrance, her arms folded across her chest. She was a tall woman with sharp cheekbones and piercing eyes that seemed to scan Kioma like she was inspecting goods at the market. "You're finally here," she said in a voice that lacked warmth. Kioma bowed slightly in greeting, but her aunt only scoffed. Obinna is not around. He traveled for business, she continued. Come inside. Let me show you where you will stay. The moment Kioma stepped inside, she noticed a stark difference between this house and her late parents' hut. The floors were smooth cement, the walls painted a dull cream. A large wooden chair sat in the middle of the parlor, next to a framed picture of her uncle. Aunt Amaka led her down a narrow hallway to a small, windowless room at the back of the house. Inside was a thin mattress on the floor, a small wooden stool, and nothing else. This is where you will sleep, Amaka said, her voice devoid of emotion. Your chores start at dawn. Kioma's heart sank. Chores? But I thought I would go to school, she asked, hesitantly. Aunt Amaka let out a sharp laugh. School? Who told you that? You should be grateful you have a roof over your head. I will not tolerate laziness in this house. Kioma swallowed hard and lowered her gaze. Her life as a housemaid had just begun. As darkness fell over the compound, Kioma lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling. The walls seemed to press in on her, suffocating her with the weight of loneliness. She missed her mother's gentle touch, her father's deep voice telling her bedtime stories. But now she had no one. The house was silent, except for the distant hooting of an owl. The cool night air seeped in through the cracks in the door. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Kioma's breath hitched as she clutched her wrapper tightly. The footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside her door. The faint glow of a lantern slipped in through the bottom of the doorframe. Then the door handle moved. Her body went stiff. The door creaked open slightly. She held her breath. A shadow loomed in the doorway, blocking the faint light from the hallway. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as the figure stood there, unmoving. Kioma's heart pounded in her chest. Then, just as suddenly as it had opened, the door clicked shut. The footsteps faded away. She exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling. What just happened? Who was at her door? Kioma didn't know, but a deep fear settled in her bones. She had a feeling that her new home was not a safe place. Kioma barely slept that night. She lay on the thin mattress, eyes wide open, heart racing with fear. Who had been at her door? The house was silent again except for the distant chirping of crickets. But the fear in her bones remained. Something felt wrong. When the first rays of sunlight crept into the small cracks in the walls, she forced herself up, exhausted but determined to face the day. Aunt Amaka's voice boomed from the kitchen. Kioma, you are still sleeping? Lazy girl, come and sweep the compound before I teach you a lesson. Kioma rushed outside, grabbing the broom. As she swept the dusty yard, she felt eyes on her. When she glanced up, her uncle, Obinna, was standing by the doorway watching her. Her stomach twisted. Obinna was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a thick beard and a presence that demanded authority. His eyes, sharp and calculating, roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. You are up early, he said, smiling. His voice was deep, too deep, with an edge she couldn't place. Yes, sir, Kioma murmured, looking away quickly. He chuckled. No need for sir. You are my daughter now. Daughter. The word tasted bitter on her tongue, but the way he looked at her, it wasn't how a father looked at his child. She lowered her head and continued sweeping. A dark warning. Later that day, Kioma stood by the outdoor fire, stirring a pot of yam porridge while Aunt Amaka pounded fufu nearby. Kioma, her aunt said suddenly, her tone sharp. She turned quickly. Yes, auntie? Aunt Amaka wiped sweat from her forehead. You are no longer a small girl. You are a woman now. In this house, you will do as you are told. You hear me? Kiyoma's grip tightened on the wooden spoon. Yes, Auntie, Amaka's eyes narrowed. And whatever happens in this house stays in this house. Kiyoma felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what her aunt was saying. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Yes, Auntie." That night, as Kiyoma lay curled up on her mattress, exhaustion finally pulled her into sleep. But her rest did not last long. The sound of slow footsteps woke her. Her eyes snapped open. "Oh, creak!" Her door was opening. Her breath caught in her throat as the dim light from the hallway spilled into the room. A tall, dark shadow stood in the doorway. Uncle Obinna. She felt paralyzed. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His heavy breath filled the small space. "Kiyoma." His voice was almost gentle, but there was something dangerous beneath it. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, but her body refused to move. "I told you, you are my daughter now." His large hand reached out. Kiyoma's heart pounded. "No, no, no." Then, boom! A loud crash outside the house shattered the silence. Obinna froze. Then came a strange howling wind, shaking the wooden windows. He turned quickly and rushed out, leaving the door slightly open behind him. Kiyoma gasped, her body finally releasing from the frozen fear. She curled up in a ball, shaking violently. The night felt colder than ever. Outside, the wind died down and the house was silent again. But Kiyoma knew this was just the beginning. Kiyoma did not sleep for the rest of the night. She remained curled up on the mattress, her whole body trembling. She had seen the look in Uncle Obinna's eyes. This was not over, and Aunt Amaka's warning echoed in her mind. Whatever happens in this house stays in this house. She felt trapped. Who would believe her? The days passed and Kiyoma's life became a cycle of endless work and silent fear. She woke before dawn to sweep the compound, washed clothes, cooked food, and scrubbed the floors. Aunt Amaka never praised her efforts, only scolded her for being too slow. Uncle Obinna watched her, always watching. His eyes followed her every movement, lingering too long on her body. Then at night, the footsteps would come. Every night, the door creaked open. Every night, Kiyoma's heart raced in terror. Some nights, he just stood in the doorway, watching her. Other nights, he came closer. He whispered things that made her skin crawl, his breath hot and heavy. He told her she belonged to him. He told her she was beautiful. And every time, she wanted to scream, but she did not. Because if she screamed, what would happen? Would Aunt Amaka save her? Would the neighbors rush in to protect her? No one would help her. One morning, after another sleepless night, Kiyoma gathered the courage to speak. Aunt Amaka was in the kitchen pounding yam, her face glistening with sweat. Kiyoma swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Auntie." Amaka did not look up. "What is it?" Kiyoma clenched her fists. "It's about Uncle." The pestle slammed into the mortar with a loud thud. Slowly, Aunt Amaka turned to her, her eyes cold, piercing. "What about him?" Kiyoma's heart pounded. "At night, he comes to my room." Silence, then slap! Kiyoma gasped as a sharp sting exploded across her cheek. Aunt Amaka's nostrils flared. "You dare open your mouth to lie against my husband!" Kiyoma clutched her burning face, tears stinging her eyes. I'm not lying, Auntie. I swear." Another slap, harder this time. "You ungrateful witch," Aunt Amaka spat. "Is this how you repay us for taking you in? How dare you accuse my husband?" Kiyoma shook her head violently. "Auntie, please listen to me." "Shut up!" Aunt Amaka grabbed her roughly by the arm and yanked her forward. "If I ever hear you say such nonsense again, I will throw you out to the streets like the orphan you are. Do you hear me? Kioma sobbed, nodding quickly. Her heart shattered into a million pieces. There would be no help. She was truly alone. Later that afternoon, Kioma went to the village stream to fetch water. She knelt by the riverbank, staring at her reflection in the water. Her face was swollen where Aunt Amaka had slapped her. Was this her life now? She wanted to run. She wanted to disappear. But where would she go? Then, a voice broke through her thoughts. You have the eyes of someone carrying a heavy burden. Kioma turned quickly. An old woman stood before her. She was dressed in a faded wrapper, her hair grey and tied back neatly. Deep wrinkles lined her face, but her eyes were sharp, wise. Kioma lowered her gaze. Good afternoon, Mama Nkechi. Mama Nkechi sat on a nearby rock watching her. Tell me, child, why do your eyes hold so much sorrow? Chioma hesitated. No one had asked her that before. For a moment, she wanted to pour out everything. She wanted to tell Mama Nkechi about her uncle, about the fear, the nights, the pain. But Aunt Amaka's words rang in her ears. Whatever happens in this house, stays in this house. She bit her lip. Nothing, Mama. Mama Nkechi studied her for a long time. Then she sighed. Listen to me, my child. The spirits of our ancestors are always watching. They see everything, even the things done in darkness. Kioma swallowed hard. Mama Nkechi's voice lowered. Justice does not sleep forever. A chill ran down Kioma's spine. Mama Nkechi stood. Be strong, my daughter. Then, without another word, she walked away, disappearing into the trees. Kioma stood there staring after her. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. That night, Kioma curled up on her mattress staring at the ceiling. Mama Nkechi's words played in her head. The spirits of our ancestors are always watching. Maybe, just maybe, something would happen. Maybe the suffering would end. Then, creak! Kioma's breath caught. The door was opening again. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. But this time, something was different. A cold wind swept through the room. A strange low whisper filled the air. Then a horrified scream ripped through the house. Kioma's eyes flew open. Uncle Obinna was screaming. And when she looked at the doorway, she saw it. A shadow, a dark, looming figure standing behind him. And for the first time ever, Kioma saw terror in his eyes. The scream that tore through the house was unlike anything Kioma had ever heard before. Uncle Obinna's voice, usually deep and commanding, was now raw with terror. Kioma sat up quickly, her heart pounding. What was happening? She turned her gaze toward the doorway, and then she saw it. A shadow. No, not just a shadow. A figure, tall, dark, unmoving. It loomed behind Uncle Obinna, casting an eerie, shifting darkness against the walls. The dim lantern light flickered wildly, as if afraid. Uncle Obinna stumbled backward, his eyes wide, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Who is there? The figure did not answer. Instead, a chilling wind swept through the room, sending Kioma's small wrapper fluttering. Then, the shadow moved. Not like a person, not like something alive. It glided. Uncle Obinna let out another scream, clutching his chest as if something unseen had just squeezed his heart. Kioma pressed her back against the wall, her breath frozen in her lungs. Was she dreaming? But this was no dream. The air in the room was thick, heavy with something unseen but undeniably present. Then for the first time the shadow spoke, but not in words. A whisper, low, hissing, like many voices speaking at once. We see you. Uncle Obinna let out a strangled cry. He tried to run, but his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, shaking violently. Kioma was too stunned to move. What was happening? Who? What was this? The shadow took another step forward, and then the lantern went out. The village awakens. Kioma didn't know how much time had passed. All she knew was that moments later, the entire house erupted into chaos. Aunt Amaka's frantic voice rang through the halls. Obina! Obina! What is happening? There were hurried footsteps, hushed whispers, the thick scent of fear in the air. Then the loud gong, gong, gong of the village warning bell sounded. Someone had woken the elders. Kioma wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She did not understand what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Something beyond this world had answered her silent cries. Something had come for Uncle Obina. The elders' judgment. By dawn, the entire village had gathered outside Uncle Obina's compound. The chief, a tall, elderly man with deep tribal marks on his face, stood before the crowd, his staff in hand. Beside him, the village dibia, the most powerful herbalist in the land, stared at Uncle Obina with dark, unreadable eyes. Uncle Obina sat on the ground, his once proud frame hunched over, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He looked like a man who had seen something not meant for human eyes. The chief's voice was stern. Obina, what happened last night? Uncle Obina swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His lips trembled. His eyes darted around wildly, like a trapped animal. It was Aunt Amaka who spoke. My husband was attacked by something. Her voice was high-pitched, frantic. A spirit! A curse! The elders murmured amongst themselves. The dibia stepped forward, his deep, raspy voice cutting through the air like a blade. A curse does not strike a man without reason. Silence fell over the crowd. Then, the dibia's eyes locked onto Kioma. She stiffened. You, he said, come forward. Kioma hesitated. The entire village was watching her now. Slowly, she stepped forward. The dibia studied her. Then he turned back to Uncle Obina. You, he said, his voice thick with accusation. What have you done to this girl? The question hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Kioma's hands curled into fists. This was it. This was her moment. She took a deep breath. Then, in a voice that was steady and clear, she spoke. My uncle has been coming to my room every night. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Aunt Amaka staggered backward, her face going pale. The chief's grip on his staff tightened. Obina, is this true? Uncle Obina's head snapped up. His eyes were wild, desperate. No, she is lying. She is lying. The dibia stepped closer, his voice low and foreboding. The spirits do not lie. A strange shudder ran through Uncle Obina's body. He opened his mouth to speak, but instead of words, he let out a blood-curdling scream. He fell to the ground, convulsing. The dibia watched him with no emotion. The ancestors have delivered their judgment. Banished forever. The chief raised his hand. Obina has brought shame upon this village. For harming a child placed under his care, he will be banished immediately. He is never to return. Cries of agreement rang through the crowd. Aunt Amaka fell to her knees, sobbing. Two strong men grabbed Uncle Obina by the arms and dragged him away. He did not struggle. He did not even speak. His face was blank, empty. Kioma watched as he was thrown out of the village gates. Then, for the first time in what felt like forever, she breathed. The chief turned to Kioma. His eyes, once hard, were now soft. You are safe now, my child. Mama Nkechi stepped forward from the crowd and placed a gentle hand on Kioma's shoulder. She will come with me, Mama Nkechi said. I will care for her. Chioma looked up at the old woman, this woman who had somehow seen her pain before anyone else did. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded. For the first time in a long, long time, she felt free. The spirits never sleep. That night, Chioma lay on a real bed, wrapped in a soft blanket. She gazed up at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the night. No footsteps, no creaking doors, no whispers in the dark. And just as she drifted into sleep, she felt something. A warmth, a presence, like a hand gently stroking her hair. She did not open her eyes. She did not need to. She knew who it was. Her mother, watching over her, and for the first time in a long time, Chioma slept peacefully.